everyone, my name is Gabby and today I'm going to be bringing you part 2 of my Back to BookTube series, and in this video I'm going to talk about all the books that I read in March, April, and May. Each month I read 6 books for a total of 18 books that we have to discuss in today's video, and because I love to ramble, I'm just going to dive right in and discuss all of these wonderful reads with all of you. If you want to check out part 1 of my Back to BookTube series where I talk about all the fun things that I've been doing over the past 3 months and why I've been sort of MIA, you can check that out. It will be linked down below. But without further ado, we're gonna dive in and discuss my reads for the past 3 months of 2018. So starting out with March, my first read of the month was none other than Heart of Iron by Ashley Poston. So I've been talking about this book a lot on my channel recently, and that's because I got to interview Ashley while she was touring to promote Heart of Iron, which is her most recent release. And if you would like to see that interview, it is live on my channel now. It will be linked down below if you want to check it out. If you do not know what Heart of Iron is about, it is a multi-perspective space opera novel that is described as Anastasia meets Firefly. Our central character in the stories is Anna, and she is found in a space pod with an android named DO9, and she's just hovering in space, and a spaceship named the Dossier ends up finding her, and when she's found, she ends up becoming a part of this crew, and they end up becoming her new family because she doesn't remember anything before getting on that space pod, so her entire family and her entire origin is completely and entirely unknown to her. And when we meet her in this story, she is looking for a cure to the glitches that DO9, or Die as he is otherwise known, is experiencing. And because Die is the one thing that she has from her past, it would be devastating to her to lose him, so she is desperately in search of a cure to the glitches that he is experiencing, and in trying to find them, she ends up coming across Rob, who is a part of the royal family within this story. And because the two of them meet, a lot of questions are brought up about Anna's origin and where she is really from, and that causes a lot of conflict within this story, and that's where you start to see some of the more Anastasia elements brought into the plot. And in Rob also coming into contact with the crew of the Dossier, he ends up meeting Jax, who you don't really get to see a lot of in this first novel, but he is quintessential to the second novel in this duology, Soul of Stars, which is coming out next summer, and the title directly alludes to him, and when you read Heart of Iron you find out why that is. So this is a really great multi-perspective space opera with queer characters, which is wonderful because I feel like you don't really see a lot of representation in more fantasy-based stories. Another thing that I think is really great about Heart of Iron is that in my mind I consider it Ashley's debut novel because Gigarella is the book that a lot of people know Ashley for. She was commissioned by Quirk to write that, so it wasn't necessarily her own story. But with Heart of Iron, this is a book that she's been working on for like 6-7 years almost, maybe even more. So this is something that's truly her own creation and something she's put her soul into, and it gives you a really good idea as to what her writing style is, and it's really well written, really fast paced, so much fun. And of course, considering all the wonderful memories that I have surrounding this book, I have to recommend it to all of you. I'm so glad I got the opportunity to read Heart of Iron and interview Ashley. It was such an amazing experience and something that I will never forget. I had so much fun reading this book, and I enjoyed it just as much, if not more so, than I enjoyed Gigarella, and Gigarella was one of my favorite reads of the year. So I'm really excited to have gotten to be able to read this to start off my March and to get to interview Ashley because it's just such a memorable experience and will be one of my highlights of 2018. My next read of the month was Friday Night Lights by H.G. Bissinger. So I had to read this for my AP Lang class as part of our pop culture unit. So as you may know, Friday Night Lights was adapted into a movie and television show, but if you are not familiar with the plot of the story, it takes place in small town Texas in a city called Odessa, and it centers around a high school football team called the Permian Panthers that are located in Odessa, Texas. And this whole novel examines the obsession with high school football in this town, and it is a real life story, so all the people that you're seeing in the story are real, they exist. H.G. Bissinger went to Odessa to sort of examine this football obsession, and he tells the story of all these football players that are on the Permian Panthers team and sort of examines how this obsession with high school football has affected them and impacted them, and he sort of examines how this obsession is going to impact their future and if it's beneficial to them at all, and sort of seeing how all the adults in this town that are obsessed with football, sort of their logic and what's going on inside their head and the things that they don't really realize that they're doing to their children and their youth in their town. And it's so compelling and interesting. I feel like the book in itself is relatively boring because it's not plot based at all. It's very much character driven. It's really weird to read a book that's so character-based and no plot driven at all, because most typical contemporaries usually are a little bit of a mix of both. But if it is more character leaning, there definitely is a plot. There really isn't a plot at all besides all of these football games and things that are happening, but that's more so to drive the characters forward. So, I mean, the book in itself is relatively boring, but I think one of my favorite things in this book that I enjoyed reading the most was the examination of education in Odessa, or more so the lack thereof. And there's one specific instance in this book that really got me, where there's this court case that goes on, and pretty much the whole thing is a debate over whether a student got a D or an F in a class. That decision of whether that grade is a D or an F will determine whether this high school football team is able to compete for the championship. It's this whole big debacle, and it goes on forever, and they're constantly going back and forth, and it's kind of amazing because you're watching all of this happen, and the big major picture is that clearly the student isn't learning and isn't getting anything out of that class, and if that's the case, then clearly they failed. The debate over like a few percentage points one way or another is not important. It's more so important that these students are being educated so that they can actually go into their future and have skills. Football, as much as we enjoy watching it and it's fun, it's entertaining, it's not a career that is going to be able to be sustaining, because your body is just not able to handle that type of physicality. And a lot of these high school kids aren't even that good to make it into the pros. If they are, that doesn't even last long before you experience serious injury. So you need real skills, and that's where the education comes in, and it's really lacked and considered in this school in favor of like sports and all of that, just because there's this pride around it and it makes the school look good, but education is sort of put to the side. So it was interesting to see that examined in this book, but truly it's not the most interesting book plot-wise, but I think it was a great book to read for school, particularly because it has so many wonderful discussion topics, and it's a really great book to have that type of roundtable discussion. So this is a really great book club book, and it was fun because in class we would read a chapter or two or like a section, and then we'd go through and discuss things, and having that discussion is what's really fun because you get to hear everyone's different thoughts on a lot of the central plot points, and it's a really great discussion starter. And I think the most interesting thing was getting to finish the book and see where all of these characters who were high schoolers throughout most of the story, where they ended up as adults, and sort of seeing how accurate H.G. Bissinger was in a lot of his analysis or his assumptions going into this and starting this whole project. And I just had a lot of fun with it. I thought it was really interesting. Of course, like I said, not the most fascinating book in the world, but the topics and things that it discusses are interesting and worth examination, and I'm glad that I got the opportunity to pick this up. And I would definitely be interested in checking out the movie or the television show. I have not watched either. I wanted to watch the television show. They took it off Netflix, so I don't think that'll be happening anytime soon, but I would love to go and pick up the movie, and I would be very interested to see how similar it is to the book. My next read of the month was The Beauty That Remains by Ashley Woodfolk. So I reviewed this book for Teen Reads, and because I went into depth there and I want to keep this video as short as possible, I will link my review down below, and you can check that out and find more out about this book and all of my thoughts and opinions on it. My next read of the month was The Diviners, book 1 in the series by Libba Bray. So if you are unfamiliar with The Diviners, this story takes place in 1920s New York City, and it follows a group of characters that each have special abilities, and throughout the series the characters use these abilities in order to deal with mystical and occult situations. And that's pretty much all I'm going to say, because I think it's one of those books that's better to go into not really knowing a lot, because you find out a lot more as you go into the story. I was ultimately inspired to read this book because of my love for The Great Gatsby. That book also takes place in 1920s New York City, and after reading that and falling in love with it in my sophomore year of high school, I really wanted to read something else that took place in 1920s New York City that was YA, and this was definitely very mainstream. It was something out there that was the first thing that came to mind when I thought YA 1920s New York City setting, and I'd heard nothing but wonderful things about it. The story is incredibly diverse in terms of the character representation. There's characters of different races and ethnicities and sexualities. There's characters with mental illness and physical disabilities. It's just so highly and well represented, and I absolutely adore it for that, because considering that it's sort of this like historical fantasy-esque story, you really don't see that type of representation that often, so I really loved that about this book. And I also loved how well researched it was. The fun thing about when I was reading this book is that I was actually in my 1920s unit in AP US history, so I would go and I would have my teacher talk about things that were happening in the 1920s culture-wise, and then I would go and read this book and I would see those same things mentioned within the story, so it felt like you were really in the 1920s in New York City. Like the Scopes trial is mentioned, which was like a really big huge case in the 1920s, and the Zacco and Vanzetti case, that was also mentioned, and it was just so well done. Like I loved it because it felt like I was right in 1920s New York City. All the characters are so interesting and so fascinating. I had so much fun with this series. I'm so excited to continue on with it. I know that said there's potentially a 4th book that is coming out, and I'm really excited for that to get released whenever it does, because I love this world. I'm so glad I got to read it because it is so much fun, so well written, so intense and fast paced, so many plot twists and cliffhangers and things that will want to just make you keep reading. I absolutely adore this series. I'm so glad I picked it up, and I'm so excited to continue on with the series. My next read of March was Hamlet by none other than William Shakespeare. So I also read this for AP Lang as part of our language unit. So here's the thing about Shakespeare. I love the plot of Shakespeare plays. Every single Shakespeare play that I've read, which is a little bit of a handful, most of which I've read for school, I've really enjoyed the plot, and I think it's incredibly interesting and witty and well written, and I adore Shakespeare. Problem is, I don't like actually reading it because the writing style is very complex and requires that extra level of comprehension, and typically with YA, you don't really need that. You can just sort of read the book without comprehension. It's just more about enjoying the story, so they're more pleasure reads. But with stuff like Shakespeare, it takes that extra level of like actually reading it and being able to comprehend it. That's not always fun. But Hamlet in itself is such an interesting story because Hamlet is a character that you could sit and analyze for hours and hours on end and never really reach a specific conclusion about the character because he's so complex and written in a way that you can never really fully understand him. And there's also so many iconic lines from this book that, or play, shall I say, that it was really interesting to finally get to read them and put them into context within the story and what was happening. I loved Hamlet. It was so fun to read, so fun to analyze, and it just reminded me of why I love Shakespeare because it's been a while since I've read anything Shakespeare. I think the last time that I read Shakespeare was freshman year because we took a break from Shakespeare sophomore year. So I was really glad to get back into Shakespeare and reading some more of his plays because of course they're incredibly well written and so much fun. Then my final read of March was the first of a multi-volume series, and that is The Untold Stories of Broadway, Tales from the World's Most Famous Theaters, Volume 1 by Jennifer Ashley Tepper. So this is the first of a 6-volume series, and I believe there are currently 3 volumes out now. It took me about a month to get through this, and the book in itself is pretty dense. Pretty much what the volumes of these stories look to do is take a set of Broadway theaters and tell their history through interviews. And so what Jennifer Ashley Tepper does is takes a theater and examines its history by interviewing different people that were involved in the shows that were running through that theater. So whether it's interviewing people who run the big major theater companies or interviewing people like actors and actresses and cast and crew that were involved in a certain show while it was running through a theater, or examining people who saw that show who were going to be upcoming people within the theater industry and how seeing that show inspired them to be involved in theater. It's just so well done and so much fun to read. Like I said, it took me about a month to get through this, and normally I read through something within the span of a few days. So the fact that this took me a month to get through is definitely saying something, but that's because I took the time to enjoy it and read through it and really be able to just get into it. And I was reading every single story and just smiling so bright, and I loved getting to find out more about Broadway theaters and a whole bunch of inside things, and it just made me realize every reason why I love Broadway. And I've had so much fun reading this first volume. I'm so excited to dive into volumes 2 and 3. I love these so much. If you are a Broadway person, these are your go-to to read. So now, starting with April, my first read of the month was Failing Up: How to Take Risks, Aim Higher, and Never Stop Learning by Leslie Odom Jr. So I reviewed this book for Teen Reads, and if you want to see all of my thoughts and opinions, my review will be linked down below. My next read of the month was Long Way Down by Jason Reynolds. Everyone in the book community absolutely adores Jason Reynolds and his books, and I'd never read anything by him before, and so I wanted to pick up one of his books. I was at Barnes & Noble, I saw Long Way Down, some people on BookTube had read it, I'd been seeing it everywhere recently, and I really wanted to read it. Interesting things about this book that made me compelled to pick it up is not only because Jason Reynolds was the author and I was interested to get to read something from him, but this book is written in verse, and it takes place over the span of a few seconds as our main character is basically just going down an elevator and his thought process as he's going down that elevator, which is so interesting. So the one thing about this book is it's incredibly short. It took me a few hours to get through, but it's incredibly intense and deals with some really dark stuff. And it was so interesting to see the way that he wrote this story, and his writing style is really great because it's not super sophisticated, but it is heart-wrenching in a way where you read it and it impacts you. And it's not because it's like this very sophisticated and elegant prose. It's just because it's written in a way that's very striking and it's meant to make you feel something. This whole little novelette, I guess, took me completely off guard. I had no idea what to expect going into it, and it just absolutely blew me away. May. I just knew that this story was going to be phenomenal, and it definitely lived up to my expectations, and I was really glad that I got to pick it up this month. Jason Reynolds is phenomenal. If you haven't read Long Way Down, I would definitely check it out. My next read of April was also a Jason Reynolds book, and that was For Everyone, a poem, a nod, a nothing to lose, and I have a review for this on TEENREADS, as I do with some of the other books that I've mentioned in this video, so if you would like to check out that review, it will be linked down below. My next read of April was Symptoms of Being Human by Jeff Garvin. So we read this book as part of the Diversity Readers Book Club. We have not had our live show yet because we had it scheduled, and then we had to end up canceling it because things got really crazy, and then like the end of the year happened and we just never rescheduled. But I did still read Symptoms of Being Human, and I really enjoyed it. This book follows our main character Riley, who is a gender fluid character, which is not a character that you typically see portrayed in YA, so the representation already is really well done. Riley's father is a senator, and so because Riley has a different identity than most people, they sort of have a tough time talking about and coming out to their parents. And so what Riley does is, at the advice of their therapist or counselor, Riley decides to run a blog where they talk about all of their thoughts and opinions on being gender fluid and what that experience is like, and to sort of provide people with an understanding of what it's like to be gender fluid. And this blog ends up going viral, and someone ends up finding out about Riley's identity and ends up blackmailing Riley. And so now this whole story is Riley having to decide whether this blog is worth running if it means being outed, and having to consider their father's political career and how that would impact him, while also having to deal with going to a new school and making friends and feeling comfortable in their own identity. So this book deals with a wide array of issues. It's incredibly well written, incredibly punching. I love the fact that this story follows a gender fluid character because I feel like you don't really see that often. There's also trans characters are within this story. There's a shit ton load of representation. It's really well done. I had a great time reading it. If you're looking for a queer story to read this Pride Month, I would definitely check out Symptoms of Being Human. My next read of April is actually a sequel that I've been meaning to get to for a while, and that is Thunderhead, Book 2 in the Arc of the Scythe series by Neil Shusterman. So if you're unfamiliar with what Scythe is about, which is a little bit of a surprise to me because this series has been blowing up on BookTube recently, the world of Scythe is a utopia. And so this story takes place in a world where disease has been conquered, famine has been conquered, and the world is, I guess, perfect in a way. And so because death has been eliminated in this world, there are scythes that pretty much kill in order to maintain the population. This story follows two scythes apprentices, Citra and Rowan, and their sort of journey into becoming scythes in a time where the world of the scythes is being vastly shaken up. So Thunderhead is book 2 in this world. It was absolutely phenomenal. So many twists and turns, so many surprises that caught me completely off guard. I was reading it the entire time. It was just so shaken up. I'm so excited to get book 3. Absolutely love this world and the characters. It's so well written, and some of our newer characters I thought were really interesting, and I liked getting to see their perspective in the story, and I'm excited to get to see more from them. I just had so much fun with this book. It definitely is very big, so it did take me a little bit of a while to get through, but I had so much fun with it because Neil Shusterman is amazing. He is such a great writer. He has so many wonderful ideas for this world. I'm really excited to see where he goes with book 3. I had so much fun reading this book. It was just such an intense roller coaster. So good, and I completely understand the hype around this series, and if you haven't checked it out yet, this series definitely lives up to the hype, and I definitely recommend you check out Scythe and Thunderhead. They are both phenomenal novels and definitely worth your read. And my final read of April was A River Runs Through It by Norman MacLean. So this is a compilation of a whole bunch of his short stories, but in my AP Lang class we only read A River Runs Through It. So this book is again incredibly boring. Really no plot to it. It's just about like fly fishing, and really it's been like 2 months since I've read this, and I can't really tell you much about it. I didn't enjoy it that much. It's kind of like I was reading it and really there's a lot of stuff that did not stick with me, but you know, I had to read it and I read it. It was okay. They made a movie out of it, so clearly it had to be worthwhile if they were to make a movie out of it. Some of the writing was really interesting at times. I mean, I think one of the reasons why we read this book was particularly because of the writing style, and the writing was definitely very interesting at times. That, I think, made it worth a read because there's times where it was very soothing and very relaxing to read. But, I mean, there's not really a lot going on with this book. I definitely wouldn't recommend it, but I did read it, so we had to put it here, and it's here, and I read it. Moving on to May, my first read of the month was Down to Cross by Arvind Amati. So this is a book that I had saw all over BookTube recently. I really wanted to get my hands on it, so I picked it up while I was at Barnes & Noble, and I read it, and I loved it. This story follows our main character, Scott, who is sort of at a crossroads in his life. He really doesn't know what he wants to do with his future, and his parents sort of have one idea for him and what they expect from him, and then he just sort of doesn't really know what he wants. So he's just sort of been obeying his parents and doing what they want, but he's a little bit of a slacker. He really isn't that motivated. And so when summer comes around and he's about to go into his senior year of high school, he ends up running off to DC in order to search after this psychologist who apparently knows the secret to success, and so he wants to be able to use her as a way to get answers, and it ends up not being that simple. And on his escapades to DC, he also comes across a little bit of an interesting character named Fiora, and she likes making crossword puzzles, so she's definitely very different. Scott and Fiora end up coming closer together, and they both end up sort of learning things from each other and forming a little bit of a friendship or relationship. And this whole story sort of follows Scott and him figuring out his future and what that means, and being able to just like come of age, you know? It's definitely a very coming of age story. And I feel like this book definitely gave me a lot of Paper Towns vibes, which I loved because you know I love John Green books, but it felt very Paper Towns-esque. Like Scott felt a lot like Q, and Fiora felt a lot like Margot, and the journey and the things that they go through felt very Q and Margot-esque, which I loved. So the story was incredibly fun. It was such a cute contemporary, and I definitely feel like for a coming of age story, it was a really great book to read, especially because this character is at that point where he's gonna be going into a senior year of high school, and you're thinking a lot about your future, and that's something I can really resonate with because I'm at that point in my life where I'm gonna be going into my senior year of high school. So I liked getting to read this because for so long I've been reading YA novels and all the characters have always been older than me, so now I'm actually reading YA novels where I'm the character's age and I'm going through the things that the characters are going through, and I can actually resonate for once, and it's really interesting and a little bit weird, but I did love this book. I think Arvind's absolutely wonderful. This cover is also absolutely stunning, and I think one of the fun things about it, there's actually a crossword here for you to solve, which I think is hysterical and I absolutely love and is just so cute. Plus this book has so many wonderful blurbs. You have blurbs from Khaled Hosseini, who's written The Kite Runner, which is such a wonderful novel. I have not read it, but it obviously is very successful. Blurbs from David Arnold, Adam Silvera, Jasmine Warga, so a whole bunch of really trustworthy people, and if they all love this book, I knew that I was going to as well, and I definitely did, so I'm really glad I got to pick this up. It was also kind of fun to get to read this because I read it before I went to DC, so it was cool to get to read and get to picture what DC was gonna be like because I was gonna be visiting there later this summer, and I just came back from my trip to DC, so it was actually kind of fun to get to read this book in anticipation of all of that. So it was a really great read and I really loved it. So my next read of May is another sequel, and that is Layer of Dreams, Book 2 in the Diviner series by Liva Bray. Book 2 is definitely very different than Book 1 in terms of the fact that you get new characters and there's a little bit of a new situation that's being brought in, and it's sort of meant to set up the rest of the story and a lot of the big conflicts that are going on. I don't know if I liked Book 2 as much as I liked Book 1, but I definitely thought it was interesting, and definitely as it started to get towards the end, it started to get more gripping, but I felt like for a lot of it, I was sort of just like waiting, and I feel like that was also because I was reading it at a time where I wasn't able to put as much of myself into the story, and I was kind of just reading it whenever I could, so it took me a while to get through this because it is pretty big. That sort of made it feel a little slow for me, but I still do love the entire Diviner series as a whole. I think it's incredibly well written. Again, I loved all the 1920s New York references because it just felt extremely relevant and well written and well researched. So it had all those elements that I loved. I just feel like because it was taking me so long to read, I felt harder to connect to the story, but I did have a lot of fun with this series. I'm really excited to pick up Book 3 because I have not picked up Book 3 yet. I'm very interested to see where the story goes. My next read of May was Emergency Contact by Mary H.K. Choi. So this is a book that again went all over BookTube recently, and after seeing it in everyone's YouTube videos, I had to go and pick it up while I was at Barnes & Noble. If you're unfamiliar with what Emergency Contact is about, account. We follow two different characters, Penny and Sam, and the two of them sort of meet in a very awkward and uncomfortable way. Out of this situation, the two of them end up exchanging numbers and end up becoming each other's emergency contacts. So they pretty much come to each other and text and talk about really deep, dark, and personal things that they aren't able to talk about with anyone else in their lives. Because these two end up coming to each other and sharing all of this, it ends up drawing them closer together. This book also explores these characters' upbringing and these sort of family situations that they've had and how they're not the best. I do have to say that I feel like this story was a little bit overhyped in my opinion. I did enjoy it, but for a large part of it, I was sort of just like waiting and waiting and waiting, and there were some cute moments, but overall I was just sort of like about it. I'm glad I did read it. I did enjoy it for the most part, but it's not one of my favorite contemporaries ever, and I feel like maybe that's just because it was a little above my age level because these characters are in college, so it is a new adult story. But I am glad that I gave this book a go. I thought it was cute. I liked the fact that you got to see Penny, who was a writer, and her sort of going through her journey of writing and her evolving as a writer and figuring out how to tell her story and sort of getting to see that process on the page. I thought that was really interesting. Sam is also a filmmaker, and I liked getting to see that and him trying to film a documentary, and I thought those things were really interesting, and I did like getting to explore the characters' upbringing and their home life, and I feel like that was interesting because they have very messy and problematic home lives and sort of the type of issues that they have and how they're able to come to each other for that. I think that the relationship they have is really beautiful, but also kind of messy at times. I enjoyed the overall, you know, outlines of the story, but I feel like it could have been better done. I just feel like I was a little bit unfulfilled. I don't know exactly what I would want, but I don't know how to describe it, and I feel like it's hard because you don't like giving criticism about a book when you can't actually say what that criticism is, other than you're just sort of left feeling unfulfilled. I am glad that I picked this book up. I did enjoy it. I just, like I said, wanted something a little bit more. My next read of the month was The Brightsiders by Jen Wild. So this is Jen's second book. You may know her for her debut novel, Queens of Geek, which I absolutely loved. It was one of my favorite reads of last year. And so The Brightsiders is Jen's second book. I reviewed it for TEENREADS, so if you would like to see my review, it will be linked down below along with all of the other books that I've reviewed for them throughout the past few months. My next read of May was another play, and that is The Importance of Being Earnest by Oscar Wilde. So I had a copy of this, and I have no idea where it went, and I wanted to film this video, and I couldn't find it, so we're just settling for a photo of the cover because this is what happens when you lose things because you have so many damn books. So The Importance of Being Earnest, I genuinely can't give you a summary for this. It's just one of those plays that you have to go into and sort of read and figure out for yourself because it's hard to give a summary for because it just sort of like you go into it and things start to happen and it makes sense as you go. Like the title starts to make sense and everything that's happening starts to make sense as you start to read it or watch it if you're seeing it actually put on. So this was a really fun thing that we got to read pretty much after we took the AP test in AP Lang, and it was sort of just like a fun thing to do before final exams and sort of just like to fill in a few gap days, and we acted it out, and so we had people who were reading the parts and it was really fun. I enjoyed getting to read it. The play is actually really humorous and really well done, and by the end of it I was like screaming because it was one of those plays where I was like reading it and I was like, I mean, it's gonna be cute or like whatever, but I really had no expectations, and then by the end of it I was like so shook because it ended in such an intense way and there were so many plot twists and like things that I just wasn't expecting at all. It threw me for a loop because I didn't expect like any really intense like gripping plot twist, and the humor was really well done and I love it. Like it's become a new favorite, and if it is in Chicago ever, I will definitely want to see it put on because it was hysterical, and I feel like actually getting to see it on stage would be marvelous. So I love The Importance of Being Earnest. It's such a really short play, so it's something you could like fly through, and it's super fun, comedic, and gripping. Like I genuinely like got invested and I wasn't expecting that at all. It was wonderful. I really enjoyed it, and I definitely think it's worth a read. Go and read The Importance of Being Earnest. If you're like a play or theater person, this is a great one to read because I had so much fun with it. So my final read of May was Neverworld Wake by Marisha Pessl, who you may also know for her novel Night Film, which is definitely a beloved one here on BookTube. So this is Marisha Pessl's YA debut because Night Film is more of an adult, new adult somewhere in there. I have not read Night Film, but I definitely want to read it now after reading Neverworld Wake. So this book was actually sent to me because TEENREADS is doing a fun little book club on Goodreads where me and a whole bunch of other teen board members are discussing the book chapter by chapter and going through and sort of talking about our thoughts and things. So I read this book in May. We're doing our discussion now, so I definitely gonna have to go through and sort of flip through this and refresh myself in order to contribute to the discussion as best as possible. But if you do not know what Neverworld Wake is about, it's hard to describe because there's just lots of stuff that goes down, and it's one of those books that, again, you just sort of need to read it and figure it out and sort of get into it as you go and you start to find out more. We follow our main character Beatrice. A year after graduating high school, she goes back and visits all of her old friends who she sort of cut herself off from after the death of her boyfriend. After spending this night with them, she ends up getting put into the Neverworld Wake with all of her friends, and so it's pretty much like Groundhog Day-esque, where they keep reliving the same day over and over and over again, but they're allowed to sort of do like whatever they want. In being put into this situation, they're pretty much given a decision where they have to vote for which one of them they want to live and then the rest die. Yeah, it's interesting, and again, you just kind of gotta read to figure it out. But what ends up happening with these characters is they use the wake to try to figure out what happened to Beatrice's boyfriend. How did he die? There's lots of twists and turns and things that you start to find out in terms of how this character died and what happened and who was there and who was responsible, and it's definitely a wild ride, and it's one of those books that, like I said, you just have to read, and the more that you read, the more that you find out and the more that it makes sense. I enjoyed it a lot. Again, very, very different than anything I've ever read before. It's one of those books that's very hard to describe because it is in itself just like a bit of a mystery and an enigma, but I loved it. I thought it was so compelling. The characters were really interesting. I genuinely don't know what to say about this book other than it just left me completely and entirely speechless. And I mean, if a book is able to do that, I think it's pretty damn good and worth a read. I was really excited to see Marisha Pessl make her YA debut because I know so many people love Night Film, and so I was really excited to get sent an arc of this book and to be able to get to read it early because I know this is a book that a lot of people are really excited about. So I'm glad I got to read it. I enjoyed it a lot. I'm super excited to get to be involved in the book club with Teen Reads and be able to share all of my thoughts and opinions with them, and I'm really glad I got to read this. It came out in June, so if you want to get your hands on a copy, it is in stores now. So that is it for my wrap up for March, April, and May. It was a really long reading month. I read 18 books in total, which is 6 books each month, which is really nice. I'm happy about that. Of course, I love to ramble and discuss, so this video is going to be excruciatingly long. I apologize. I don't like doing that, but it's what happens. Thank you all so much for watching. If you want to follow me on social media, you can check me out on Instagram and Twitter at GabbyYABooks with one Y. That is GABBYABOOKS. If you want to find out what I am reading each month, you can check me out on Teen Reads and Goodreads, and you can see all of my reviews and you can see what books I'm reading. The links to both of those are down below. My email is also down below. If you would like to shoot me an email for any reason, it's there. And all of the links that I mentioned throughout this video are also down below, so a lot of fun stuff going on in the description. Definitely worth checking out. I think that's about it for this video. Thank you all so much for watching, and if you made it to the end, thank you so much. I'll see you next time with a new video. Goodbye!
Broadway, here I come.